I'm going to introduce the speaker today. He's a writer of 3 books, a TV producer, a journalist who's written for the LA Times and the New York Times, a musician and a documentary filmmaker, and he's done a lot of stuff. And he is the author of another book that we'd like to highlight from the history of William Mulholland, St. Francis Dam, and California water history. It's called Thirsty, William Mulholland, California Water in the Real Chinatown, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Marc Weingarten.
Thanks, Alan. Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having me. It's an incredible library you have here. Very impressive. We don't have anything like this in LA. Not quite. Well, the Central Library, of course, but too far for me. So yeah, I wrote this book. You're the Historical Society, so you probably know a bit about this stuff as well. A number of years ago, I was casting about for an idea to write about. I've written a book about new journalism and some other things. And I came across a little 200-word piece in the LA Times about the dam collapse, and I frankly had no knowledge of it. I didn't know about it. It piqued my interest hugely when I realized that it was one of the tragic man-made disasters of the 20th century. And I didn't understand why more people, including me, didn't know about it. So I went down the rabbit hole, as writers are wont to do. Started researching it. Was so fascinated by all the facets of the story. Started writing the book. And then sort of grappled with the notion of Mulholland's culpability in all this. I'm sure you're familiar with Cadillac Desert, Mark Reisner's book, and it's a really damning portrait of Mulholland. And having researched this, it didn't quite sit right with me. I don't think he was a man of evil intent, necessarily, nor do I think he was a man that was out for financial gain, necessarily. He was very well paid by the city of Los Angeles. He lived a nice life. I think civic altruism was his primary motive. He cared about the city so much he fell in love with it when he embarked here from Ireland as a young man, and he wanted the best for it. I think what he and many others couldn't anticipate was the nature of the population boom that happened in the city and how quickly it grew. I'm sure a lot of this is redundant to you folks, but just to give you some background. So the city initially was using the LA River water, and that worked for a while. There was a system of sluices and pipes, open pipes, that snaked through the city called the Zanja system. These were open pipes that were prone to all kinds of impediments getting into them, filth, and even dead bodies occasionally they had to pick out of these things. There was a water wheel downtown in the plaza that conveyed the water. This quickly became an untenable situation, and they started digging for aquifers underground springs, an elaborate system of wells to extract as much water as they could from these artisan springs, and that was insufficient. And then you compound all that with the massive chicanery that was going on in Los Angeles at the turn of the century, and some very enterprising and shady folks that were controlling water at this period of time. There was a man named Prudent Beaudry who made his fortune selling ice, of all things, who built a couple of hydroelectric dams in eastern Los Angeles, and had the notion that he pitched to the city that he would take over this rather unruly water system and run it with his private company. So that's what happened, and that happened for decades. Prudent Beaudry ran the water system. It was a private system for decades, and he ran it poorly. And he was a very greedy man. There was a lot of greedy men in Los Angeles in those days. The most prudent, no pun intended, move he made was to hire young Mulholland to work with him. And when the city wrested back the water supply and the water system from Beaudry, Mulholland came along and eventually wound up running the water department while still in his 30s. And astonishingly, he had no college education. He was a complete autodidact, self-taught, loved LA and just walked the city and learned everything he could about the water, the land, the topography. That was his education. And then in 1913, of course, the aqueduct was built because Mulholland decided that that was the only option to bring in water to a city that was growing so rapidly that no one had any idea how to supply water for it. So on to Owens Lake and the aqueduct, which was built in 1913. And then, of course, we all know the story about how the aqueduct sucked the valley dry, Owens Valley, creating an alkaline-infested and eventually extremely dusty conditions around the lake. And as you know, there was an insurrection, a movement against the aqueduct as the years went on, and Owens Valley began to lose their agricultural business. And there was sabotage. I'm sure you all know this. And yet, Mulholland stood fast, knew the aqueduct was the only way, and built dams to allocate and hold water for the aqueduct. So the St. Francis Dam was one of these dams, of course. And what I'd like to do is read a few excerpts from the book, just to get into what happened after the dam collapsed, and then sort of reverse engineer back into causes, reasons as to why the dam might have collapsed. And why, in my view, Mulholland was certainly culpable. There was a long-held view that there were certain theories about dam collapses that weren't in wide circulation in 1928, and so Mulholland might not have even known about certain theories that might have led to the collapse of the dam. But as I started digging into this and reading further, I realized that that really wasn't the case. So first I'm going to get into just the aftermath, what happened after the dam collapsed and the horrible tragedy. So it was a valley of mud and timber, the scattered remnants of homes strewn across the landscape. Dead animals lay in the street. Collapsed bridges acted as makeshift dams for the trickle of water that continued to flow to the ocean. Giant piles of telephone poles, felled trees, and chicken wire lay everywhere. In Santa Paula, 135 homes were completely destroyed and 87 badly damaged. There was $500,000 in total damage in this region alone. From San Francisquito to Ventura County, in an area that spanned 54 miles, the human toll from the dam collapse was astonishing. Some of the bodies resembled casualties of war, others were untouched. The wave had killed people in their beds and then simply tossed them out. Many of the victims traveled with the water for hundreds of miles. Residents of San Diego, 300 miles away on the far southwest coast of Southern California, discovered bodies weeks after the fact. There were dead bodies everywhere, but sometimes you had to look hard for them as they were buried, underneath the debris. Rescue crews often had to gingerly pull the corpses out from under piles of refuse and then hope that nothing fell on them. It was as if the corpses were the key pieces in a grim game of pickup sticks. The terrain now resembled the valley in pre-settlement days. It was barren, denuded. What life remained was high up in the trees, and utility lines where survivals held on for dear life until someone somewhere might come to rescue them. If you found yourself in the swirling eddy at any time during the night, chances are you were already dead. So then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. The city of Los Angeles acted quickly, sending hundreds of LAP officers to Newhall, but at first it seemed as if they might have landed in the wrong place. Citizens were throwing things at them, yelling at them to turn around and go home. Someone even tried to run over a few officers with their Model Ts. The LAPD were treated not as saviors, but as pariahs. They were the first physical manifestation of the evil empire in Los Angeles that had caused this horrific disaster. And they were insolent and listless, according to one newspaper report. Every department of the Los Angeles Police Department seemed to look on this calamity as a fine chance for a junketing trip. Quote, "It wasn't just the St. Francis Dam collapse that had the people's dander up. They looked upon the disaster as a metaphor for all the double dealing, manipulation, false promises, and deceit that the Owens Valley water grab and by extension, the San Francisquito water acquisition had engendered. Many of the people of Santa Clara had premonitory glimmerings of an impending disaster, or at least they had said so after the fact. Regardless, they knew bad practices led to bad consequences. And we're thus now faced with the inevitable result of Mulholland's unholy alliances and broken promises. Never mind that the truth had been distended into ungainly myth. Los Angeles had been supplying the Santa Clara Valley with an abundance of surplus water before and after the dam's completion. Santa Clara would have none of it. One woman who had spent days trying to clear the mud in front of her entryway had instead begun devoting her time to painting a sign in 2 colors. She placed the sign above her muddy doorway. It read, "Kill Mulholland." So that was the situation. People were upset. An inquest was immediately called for in Los Angeles. Public hearing to determine culpability and how this came to be. Mulholland was receiving death threats, and he was sort of locked up in his house on St. Andrew's Place. And then he was compelled to testify. So this is Mulholland's piece of Mulholland's testimony. Did you get solid rock down there? Yes, sir, the rock of the country. Unfortunately, the accident has given a difference, as I see, appearance to things now. It has cut the way the flanges and sides of the trench we dug and the arches torn out there, and it looks as if the dam has rested on the flat ground, as the drawings will show. We have the topography of the original surface as it was when we first started before we put anything there. We put the instruments there and made a complete survey of the whole thing. We very fortunately have got that. I don't see why I should use the word fortunately, but it's a fact that it would convince maybe people that we did not build the thing as stated by certain publications, that we laid the thing flat on the ground. We went down deep in the trench there. What had happened was that there was speculation that the ground was built on unstable schist, and that in the west abutment of the dam, it was actually built underneath an active fault line. As it turned out, as Dr. Rogers has pointed out, dams can survive on shifts for, it was irrelevant actually. The schist had nothing to do with the dam collapsing. This is sort of my verdict on Mulholland. So Mulholland had complex motives for doing the things he did: ego, civic pride, but greed was certainly not one of them. There were no smoke-filled rooms, no backdoor maneuvers to pay Mulholland beyond his already extravagant salary. If Mulholland had wanted to enrich himself, he certainly easily have gone into practice as a consultant, which, given his experience and knowledge, would have likely made him the most in-demand water pasha in the U.S. It was certainly hubris that allowed Mulholland to endeavor to build giant dams without taking a single engineering class. But it wasn't lack of education that destroyed the St. Francis Dam. Mulholland certainly wasn't the first self-schooled expert in the field. Brash young men without portfolios were the norm rather than the exception at the turn of the century. In fact, they tended to be the empire builders of their time. We know now that the St. Francis Dam was a deeply flawed dam, both in its design and the location of the dam itself. But was it Mulholland's fault? This is something that I grappled with for a long time. I just wasn't sure if it was lack of foreknowledge. You know, it was really difficult, given how angry people are, of course, still about this issue. It was hard to sort it out, but this is sort of what I came up with. Okay, so I discussed the schist issue, and that theory held for a long time. Charles Outland, who's one of the first people to write about the St. Francis Dam, came to that conclusion, and it held for a while. But then David Rogers, who's been here, I know, had some other things to say about it. So this theory was received wisdom for almost 50 years until a geological engineer from UC Berkeley named J. David Rogers offered an alternative opinion. Rogers found Outland's research to be sound with one key distinction. Just because the St. Francis Dam was erected on shaky schist didn't necessarily mean that its failure was a foregone conclusion. In an interview with the Bureau of Reclamation, Rogers noted that 100 dams in the U.S. had been built on schist, and not one of them had collapsed. If redundancies are built into a dam with the proper cutoff walls, drainage systems, grouting, etc., then a dam can hold indefinitely in schist. So the true culprit, as you probably know, was the stub-toe nature of the dam's construction. In other words, the dam was too high up top and too low on the bottom. And this created something called uplift. And what happened was water started seeping underneath the toe of the dam, underneath the dam. Now, in 1928, the theory held for a long time that no one really knew about uplift theory, or it wasn't orthodoxy. People hadn't extensively discussed it. But in fact, that might not be true. At least there were numerous reports about uplift. So I'll jump ahead. In short, uplift was not exactly an arcane concept. There had been numerous papers, symposiums, and books that explicitly addressed the problem. And by the time Mulholland set out to build the St. Francis Dam, there had been examples of other dams that had been built with uplift in mind. Mulholland would have been well aware of the extensive coverage given to uplift in all the relevant engineering journals, yet his dam was insufficient in regard to uplift pressure. Even within his own state, there had been dams recently constructed with drainage systems that ran the length of the dam, as well as cut-off trenches and drainage wells to prevent excessive water pressure. Perhaps if Mulholland had bothered to consult with some of his contemporaries, he would have been more conversant on the subject of uplift. But as a maverick autodidact, he had spent nearly half a century going his own way, and it worked for him. The benefits to be gleaned from garnering all the credit for public works that literally helped to create a modern city were manifold. Mulholland had accrued power that way, and he didn't want to be held accountable in such a way. So there were no regulatory systems in place, obviously, in those days. Mulholland built the dam by, everything was overseen by him. There wasn't any third party that would look over these dams and check for safety trenches and drainage and so on that one needs for these gravity dams. So, in fact, even though Mulholland's career was ruined by this, and I was wondering if he was a tragic figure or not, in fact, I think he's quite culpable. There's really no excuse for not having foreknowledge of such things if you're a civic engineer in a city like Los Angeles. jump ahead a little bit. Out of the ruins of the dam collapse emerged an important precedent. The world's first dam safety agency, uniform engineering testing criteria, and a state-mandated process for arbitrating wrongful death suits, all of which are still in place today. In the years following his death, Mulholland's legacy remained ambivalent, and it remains so today. Roads and reservoirs are named after him, but it's unlikely that among the millions who drive along Mulholland Drive, few, if any, know much about the man whose name graces the picturesque mountain passes. If they think of him at all as with great disdain, there are compelling reasons to think of Mulholland this way, but one cannot efface from history his crucial contributions to the making of LA. So I think he's a gray figure. He's neither black nor white. He's somewhere in the middle. He did help to build this city, and I guess that's a great contribution regardless of, or whatever your opinion of LA is. It's certainly a monumental contribution. So there's that, but then 400 people died. So it was very difficult to grapple with that and to sort of figure that out for myself. But yeah, anyway, so that's that. That's all I got.
Are you aware of the other book that, I don't want to plug in any book, but I happen to read it called Heavy Ground?
Oh yeah, that's the big.
Yeah, two scholars over at Huntington, but they came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
You did, for much the same reasons, although, as you say, it's a fairly thick book, and the technical stuff, I didn't understand it.
Yeah,
You're aware of that?
I am aware of that, yeah. That's actually groundbreaking research.
Yeah.
Because in fact, and as they also point out in that book, there were a number of dams that have been built, gravity dams that have been built that held up fine. They just have the proper drainage and they functioned perfectly fine. But they didn't, but Mulholland refused to or didn't bother to include these features in his dam. And this is the great tragedy ensued.
I will say, we live near his fountain, so I'm part of the history.
Oh, in River Park.
River Park area, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But the water and park department, they don't mention St. Francis Dam. It's like, it would bother me, and I liked Mulholland, I think he was a visionary and very important man, but the idea of cleansing this from their history, like it never happened, with 500 people dead, I find ridiculous. We even had a water and power crew, they're all educated this way, they don't never come in to St. Francis Dam. We had them in front of our house a month ago.
I was talking to Alan prior to this,
Yeah.
and he was talking about how they're trying to get a memorial built,
Yes.
which would be great.
After all these years.
Yeah, after 80 years or whatever it is. It's absurd. I mean, it should be. I didn't know.
Yeah.
While we're on this subject, and yet you're correct about kind of the whitewashing. Actually, a colleague of mine a year or two ago called over to the DWP because we wanted to coordinate an event with them about the 100th anniversary of Aqueduct. And he mentioned the dam, and I'm not saying that this represents, and it's just one person there, but it was a PR person for the DWP, and he mentioned the dam thing, and she told him, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It happened in 1928.
No, there were.
I'm curious about your thought process about what attracted you to this subject. I don't know your background. I just think it's really interesting what drew you
My
to.
background is I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist for years.
But I mean, it's interesting because
I was just because I love LA history. I've always been intrigued by that. And then I read about this dam, and then I sort of reverse engineered the dam back into Mulholland, back into the LA Times, which I find so fascinating. Chandler and Harrison Otis, right? Harrison. That was fascinating to me. So there's just all these things, the Watersons.
Can you explain again about, you said you didn't use this term, it's something like it was top left, or can you talk about the structural, what that was? Can you explain that again?
Mulholland, secretly, as it turned out, he overfilled the dam.
Yes.
For one, there was too much water in it. And then he didn't have enough drainage to relieve whatever subsequent pressure. And so what happens is, when that happens, and then it was too narrow on the base, it starts moving horizontally.
So
It
you, in
actually
other words,
starts-
it's built sort of like this?
It's like that, yeah, I'm sorry, I should have
Oh, no,
explained that.
that's, oh.
It's like this, and then what happens is it starts going like this.
So why did he fill it so high? Was it like an ego thing to show how much, I mean, what is
Because
ego?
he needed to store as much water as he possibly could. And that was just going with it.
Yeah, he was warned about that too.
Yeah, he was warned about that too. He was warned about it by one of the maintenance workers that worked on the dam itself.
Huh.
But he didn't heed anybody's, he didn't heed anybody's advice.
They raised the height of the thing too.
And they raised the height of it too, yeah.
But-
To accommodate the water.
Didn't they have a landslide on the like east wall?
Yeah.
They did have a landslide, but that was okay.
And the landslide, was that caused by the dam?
The landslide was caused by, well, the shift was a little unstable, but it would have survived that had he not done what I just
Right.
talked about, you know? Sure.
So, first of all, the inquest, did it result in any criminal charges? That's usually.
It did not result in criminal charges, but it placed the blame squarely on Mulholland, and his career was finished. I mean, it was over.
Was that before or
Resigned.
after Mulholland Drive had been named? Do you know?
Yeah, oh, yeah. He was just crushed. He volunteered. I mean, he resigned, and then he died a number of years after.
There were no mechanisms within his organization for differences of opinion.
No.
He was the sole,
He was the guy. He was the dictator.
and so he didn't have like a committee of people
No.
sitting there going, okay, what about?
Absolutely not. And in fact, and I'm not even sure if this is true because there's been a lot of apocryphal stories written about this stuff, but the dam itself was kind of built in secret, like he didn't really tell people about it. And it was sort of tucked away, and he wanted to make sure no one, so, and it's a toxic way to conduct large-scale civic projects. That's
Why would he be in secret if he was the czar?
right.
You know, I mean, why hide anything?
Not secret, but just like, I'm just gonna, you didn't have to file permits.
Yeah.
Did it?
There was no regulation.
There's no
He
regulation.
was the regulation.
Yeah, he was the regulation, exactly.
What?
Sure.
If there was any regulations, it would have just been an exempted project. So it would have not had to apply anyways.
Now, why is that?
Well, it's just because at the time, you can get exemptions on a lot of things unless it has certain impacts. So the city of Los Angeles could have exempted whatever they needed to, and they do that even today on certain things. And I'm not talking about just one project.
I can't imagine that there isn't entirely more oversight now than there was.
There's a whole lot more than that, but I'm just saying, at the time, it could have been just an exemption if there was a regulation that would.
But there was not, so
There wasn't.
there wasn't even an exemption. I'm sorry.
It's
Sure.
hard to imagine so much power would be put into one man with what is, by today's standards, limited education and so forth. To me, that's what's fascinating about the whole process.
Oh, sure.
Mulholland is a self-made man, it seems, self-educated for the most part, and all this power was put into him, and okay, we're just gonna do what he says, and
And he had powerful allies too.
yeah, that's always, that to me is the amazing.
LA Times.
This would never happen in today's world.
The LA Times, which of course, even hard to believe now, was such a powerful media organ in Los Angeles. And Otis and Chandler were wholeheartedly for whatever Mulholland wanted to do. So that would really help the bonds pass.
Sway public opinion, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
Let everybody sort of overlook.
Exactly. And it was
the downsides or the.
It's fascinating. The story's fascinating. And then there was this man named John Harriman, who was a socialist who tried to run on the anti-Mulholland ticket in Los Angeles. I mean, there's so many fascinating characters. All these self-made hustlers, basically, foisting themselves on a credulous public who ate up the LA Times. It was almost a propaganda sheet in those days, and LA Times was massively popular. I'm sorry, sir?
One gentleman behind me mentioned the aspect of a secret project. Wasn't the city of LA secretly purchasing land up there?
Yes, that's the other
to facilitate this?
The other element of the story, there was a man named Fred Eaton that also ran the water department prior to Mulholland, and for a brief time was the mayor of the city. And he was the LA's proxy, and he went up. They were afraid that if it was above board, that there would be rampant speculation and they wouldn't be able to afford to buy all this land. And so he had to buy all the land surrounding the lake to get all the water rights for the, see, water rights can fill up a 1,000-page book.
Yeah.
That is very complicated. But anyway, in short, they needed this land for the water.
They
And
got it in a
so-
bargain, right?
What's that?
They got the land in a big bargain.
Oh, huge bargain, yeah, yeah. Fred Eden is another fascinating character, one of the first families of Los Angeles. His father was a lawyer who founded growing orange groves in Pasadena, which at that time was an agricultural collective at the turn of the century. I mean, I just eat up this LA stuff. I love it. And so I probably spent entirely too long researching this. Because I love the stories. And it's so under, you know, so there's that book, and there's a number of books that have come out this year about this, but it's so underrepresented. I'm sorry.
What's the status of, like, there's a sister dam, a Hollywood dam?
Hollywood dam.
They all in the same kind.
That's correct.
Is that thing drained or full?
It's full. It works fine. But there's a funny story about that dam. There was a man who lived on Lake Hollywood that started publishing like a one sheet because everyone was scared shitless that that dam was going to burst. And you know, it was the days when people could just, I'm gonna start a newspaper, and they would just run off these. And there was a number of men that did that. There was a very vociferous anti-Mulholland press that was going on at the time, but you couldn't fight the power of Otis. Sir?
I was going to say about the secrecy of the dam, because I read a book a while back, I forget which book it was, but I got the impression that it wasn't done in secrecy because at the time Mulholland was also in charge of all the water ducts, and you know, you mentioned that there was a lot of terrorism. People.
Yeah, exactly. As I mentioned before, yes, they blew up pieces of the aqueduct.
To keep the dam safe.
There were some fairly organized insurrections, and that's another fascinating story. They were the most powerful and the most well-organized of this anti-aqueduct group was run by these brothers named the Wattersons. Well, as it turned out, the Wattersons were embezzlers. And they went to jail. So in the middle of this whole thing, they were found guilty of embezzlement and went to jail, and the movement stopped dead in its tracks. I mean, the stories were insane what happened, you know. And these guys were like beloved sons, you know, it's so fascinating.
I'm under the impression that Mulholland's still served on the water board for 20 years after he, not as chairman, but as a seat on the water board. Is that correct?
That is correct, but he did have a seat on the water board. He did. I can't speak to what kind of influence that might have had on the water board. I don't know. I didn't research it extensively, but I can't imagine how active he was on the water board in those days. He was a pretty broken man, and his wife had died. So
He actually died 7 years after the disaster, so couldn't have
So
been
good
too long.
name.
yeah.
After the dam collapsed, there was still a portion of it left that was
Right.
called the tombstone.
Right.
And they destroyed that, they blew it up for some
How?
reason.
I didn't know that.
I was gonna ask you also for your perspective in regards to that. I'm gonna lead into that with a question to you. 88 years later, this is why we're trying to make a national memorial at the site. This is an event that was a huge news story in 1928.
Oh yeah, front page of the New York Times.
Right, if you look at our website, we have a collection of newspapers from all over the country, huge banner headlines everywhere. This was not a small story.
Right.
And yet 88 years later,
It is.
nobody's heard of it. The fact that he's never heard it, he hadn't heard of it, we hear this all the time. So then the question becomes, why is that? And what is your perspective as to the politics at the time?
Because well, first of all, LA is genius at effacing its past. That's what LA does. LA just wants to reinvent itself and efface whatever ugliness came before. So the death of the red cars, the dam collapse, it goes on and on. And so it's the collective memory chooses not to face. It's just the way, it's just the psyche of this city. It's just the way it works. And then the water department, it was in their best interest. Although they do, to be fair, there is a little exhibit in the DWP. If you walk into the actual DWP building, you've probably seen it. There is a little, it sort of reminds me of years ago, I went to the Nixon Library. I was doing a story in the Nixon Library. And they had this huge library and this little corridor about Watergate. It went from there to there. And it was enclosed, and you couldn't really see it, and you had to walk through to see it. It's the same thing. It's the same.
That's changed now, finally.
I know it changed.
But before you go on, just to answer the person's question back there. A couple of perspectives I have on this forgotten is I think at the time, LA was a very up and coming, wheeling, dealing city, and they could not afford for their public image to have this disaster hang as a noose on their neck. In addition, there was a national problem in that at the same time that the dam failed, you had a bill in Congress
For the Hoover Dam.
and that was endangered by this disaster. So there were a lot of reasons.
Yeah, that is absolutely.
There were a lot of reasons why it was a good idea to get this pushed under the rug.
Which Mulholland was a major advocate of that sort of concept.
And for the person's question back there about the tombstone, so the tombstone was this looming PR nightmare for Los Angeles, sitting there in San Francisquito Canyon. And so as part of getting this out of the public view, about a year after the dam failure, there were two kids that climbed up on the tombstone, and one kid thought he was going to be funny and threw a snake at the other kid, and the kid fell off and died. And this was kind of the last straw in terms of Los Angeles's PR nightmare out there, and then they decided to explode the tombstone and let it tilt over. If you go out to the dam site today, the remains of the tombstone are just laying like this now across there.
When did they blow it up?
1929, about a year after.
What is the Chinatown argument? Then
It's fiction.
movie Chinatown too.
It's fiction. It's in my book. I address the movie in the book. It's a movie. But the problem is it's been the prevailing myth of the city for forever. It's sort of like that's really taken over as the prevailing myth. But I don't buy it.
In your research, I was wondering if you came up with any kind of associations with Mulholland and Reginaldo de Valle. De Valle, of course, was a state senator on the water thing, and his home is Rancho Cumulos, of which there are a couple of dozens here. Rancho Cumulos is like right down on 126. When the dam broke, the waters came up to the chapel. But it was okay. We'd love to guys have you out there Sunday afternoon tours. There's my marketing pitch. But Reginaldo was very much a mover and a shaker, and he was on the water board. There's a picture, I think, of Mulholland and de Valle in a big pipe. In which they're sitting in the pipe and stuff. So I'm kind of wondering, did de Valle himself, let me know about where San Francisquito Canyon? But there's an awful lot of stuff there, and I'm always curious as to find out.
There's so much stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff. It should be mentioned that, you're talking about the pipes, the actual feat of building the aqueduct was rather extraordinary. It's probably Mulholland's greatest achievement. And you think about an era before Caterpillar tractors were just sort of coming on. Very little mechanization going on. It was all basically built by horses and men. And in 71, it was named one of the great, civil engineering landmarks in the country. So, and he did it actually ahead of time. There was a time table. He built it under budget and ahead of time. So It was rather extraordinary, achievement. Sure.
The Mulholland Dam, or Lake Hollywood Reservoir, which is the same type of dam. We actually hike around it like a lot of
It's
thousands of
beautiful.
people. But we just discovered, it's in the book I was reading, that because of the fear that that was gonna go next, they actually, on the dry side, they built up dirt and added landscaping so it wouldn't look steep. To create the illusion that it was not a steep dam. And we look at that all the time, and we're in, oh, there's a landscaping right there. So
It's definitely quite beautiful too. It's very beautiful.
It's very nice.
It's worth it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
More guys to this challenge.
It's great.
It didn't know it's still water, it's worth it.
But they did call it an illusion, which is really
It's
is.
Los Angeles. It's Hollywood. Sure.
Well, I just have a comment that might make you feel a little bit better about Mulholland. In the 1960s or 70s, the U.S. Corps of Engineers built a dam across where the Chapalaya River goes out of the Mississippi River to keep the Mississippi from going down to the Chapalaya. And every time the Mississippi would flood, they'd let some water go over the dam. So after one of the floods, and they closed the gates, they realized that the water flowing over the dam had almost completely undermined the dam. So this was the Corps of Engineers,
In the
highly
60s.
educated engineers in
Interesting.
the 1960s
That's
to build
really
this dam, which almost did the
Right, that's
same
really
thing.
interesting. Thank you, folks. Pleasure.